In this lesson, we will discuss ignition system, start system, automatic start, in-flight start, manual start, and dry cranking. FADEC controls the ignition system utilizing 2 igniter boxes per engine to convert 115-volt AC power into high-voltage energy for engine starting and for engine flame-out protection. During an automatic start, only one igniter fires, and FADEC alternates igniters used on successive starts. Ignition comes on when N2 reaches 16% and cuts off when N2 reaches 50%. During a manual start, both igniters fire when the master switch is placed to on, and they stop when N2 reaches 50%. Continuous ignition is automatically selected on when the engine anti-ice is turned on, and engine flameout is detected, or the engine interface unit fails. Ignition may be manually selected on by placing the engine mode selector to ignition. The engine start system consists of a start valve, an air starter, 2 ignition boxes, and 2 igniters, A and B. Pneumatic air for starting is provided by the APU, a ground pneumatic start unit, or in the case of a cross-bleed start, by the other operating engine. If there is an electrical fault in the start valve, a manual override handle allows a ground crewman to operate the valve manually. The starter uses the same drive gear system as the accessory gearbox, only in reverse. Air from the start duct turns the starter turbine, which in turn drives the N2 rotor through the accessory gearbox drive shaft. At 50% N2, the centrifugal clutch disengages. If the clutch fails to disengage, cutter pins inside the starter unit will cut the rim from the turbine wheel containing the parts within the starter unit. There are 2 start modes, automatic and manual. For an automatic start, FADEC has full authority over the start valve, ignition, and fuel, and will abort the start in case of start valve failure, starter engagement time limit, ignition failure, HP fuel shutoff valve failure, high EGT, engine stall, hung start, overspeed, or no light up. Select the engine mode selector to ignition start. Then, after all amber X's have disappeared from the upper ECAM, indicating that FADEC has powered up, place the master switch to on. Observe that the start valve opens. N2 and oil pressure increase. At 16% N2, the ignition is indicated. At 22% N2, fuel is introduced and light up begins. At 50% N2, the start valve closes and the igniter shuts off. Once the engine is stabilized, the second engine is started in the same way. After both engines have been started, the engine mode selector is selected back to norm. Start fault messages are generated to the ECAM. The amber fault light on the engine control panel also illuminates if a fault is detected or if there is a disagreement between the high-pressure shutoff valve and the master switch. When a start fault is detected, FADEC will crank the engine to clear out any fuel vapors, then control any additional start attempts if allowed. Up to 3 additional starts will be attempted, depending on the fault. The automatic start sequence can be interrupted at any time by placing the master switch to off. Note, once the master switch has been placed to on, selecting the engine mode selector from ignition start to norm has no effect on the start sequence. For an in-flight start, FADEC determines whether the engine is windmilling fast enough or needs assistance from the starter. Both igniters are activated. In the event of an abnormal start, fault warnings are generated, but FADEC does not automatically abort the starting sequence. If an automatic start has been aborted due to engine stall, high EGT, or low start air pressure, or if it is anticipated that start pressure will be marginal due to hot or high conditions, use the manual starting procedure. A manual start is accomplished by selecting Ignition Start on the engine mode selector. The ECAM engine page appears. After all amber X's on the upper ECAM page disappear, select the manual start push-button switch to on. The start valve opens. At 20% N2, the master switch is placed to on, and ignition and fuel are introduced. When N2 reaches 50%, the start valve closes and the ignition goes off. The engine manual start push button is then selected off. After the second engine is started, the engine mode selector is selected back to norm. During a manual start sequence, FADEC monitors start parameters and generates abnormal start messages to ECAM. The crew must take the appropriate actions to abort the start. The only exception is if the start EGT is exceeded before 50% N2. In this case, FADEC aborts the start. The crew interrupts a manual start before the master switch is placed to on by switching the manual start push-button switch to off. After the master switch has been placed to on, the starter is aborted by switching the manual start push-button switch to off and then placing the master switch to off. Dry cranking allows the crew to ventilate the engine to remove fuel vapors after an unsuccessful start attempt. With the engine mode selector set to crank, selecting the manual start push button to on will re-engage the starter to dry crank the engine. Do not re-engage the starter when N2 is greater than 20%. In this lesson, we have discussed ignition system, start system, automatic start, in-flight start, manual start, and dry cranking.